Welcome to the second of the Trust series, webinar series, Society Talks, which we launched last week, Wednesday, same time. And this week, our topic for discussion this week is on COVID-19 economic relief packages and the future of social protection. We have seen that the COVID crisis is more than a health crisis. It has far-reaching economic impacts, particularly when we consider the pre-existing weaknesses in our social, economic, and political structures. In Africa, COVID has disrupted the livelihoods of millions of people, with a disproportionate impact on poor households, on small and informal traders, on women, on young people, and on a lot of people that actually exist on the peripheries of our economies. We've seen across the region border closures, which have had negative consequences on informal traders. And yet we have seen very biased attention in the form of government responses that we have seen so far, very much biased around paying attention to the needs of bigger businesses, looking at questions around how to better move cargo across the borders and move goods across the borders, and deep analysis on the impact of COVID on the tourism sector and other sectors that are considered within the formal economy. We've been paying attention to a number of the economic responses that our governments have put in place, and we are deeply concerned about the stuck gaps that remain within these responses. Even in cases such as the response that we have seen come out of South Africa, which we have considered and thought about as progressive, responses that are coming out of Mauritius and other countries, we see a gap in terms of a neglect of taking a regional approach and looking at what the implications of these responses are for regional integration. And there isn't much of a differentiated approach in the responses in terms of looking at and responding to the needs COVID responses that are relevant to the needs of women, that are relevant to the needs of young people, that are relevant to the needs of informal traders, and that are relevant to the needs of migrant populations in our region. Despite the important role that migration plays in driving our economies, including the important role that economic actors in the informal economy play and contribute to our growth. We've also seen gaps in the extent to which small-scale farmers have been considered and the implications of COVID for food security and access to food in both urban spaces and in rural areas. The gaps that we're seeing don't come as a surprise to us, because a lot of the work that civil society has been doing and the advocacy agenda has been pointing to the inequalities in our policy spaces that are driving deep levels of poverty and inequality. And it is for this reason that we have invited 3 panelists this afternoon who've been working on inclusive economic responses throughout the region, and mainly looking at the nature of social protection and the extent to which our development models respond and provide for the socioeconomic rights of marginalized communities. I have with me 3 speakers this afternoon. I've got Isobel Frye, who is the Director of the Studies of Poverty and Inequality, and Director of Studies at Inequality and Poverty Institute, and is based in South Africa. Welcome, Isobel. I also have with me this afternoon Herbert Jauch, who is Chairperson of the Economic and Social Justice Trust and is based in Namibia. We will be joined a little bit later by Deprose Muchena, who is the Regional Director of East and Southern Africa at Amnesty International. I'm going to start with Isobel. One, because there's been so much of a focus on South Africa's economic relief package that was announced by President Ramaphosa. And in the early days of the South African response, there was a lot of celebration in terms of that being a progressive response and one that was seen to be more inclusive than what we had seen. Just to open up the floor and ask you to please comment on your take on the South African response, and also based on what you know about the socioeconomic status of marginalized peoples throughout the region, whether we're seeing trends that are inclusive enough and are responsive to the needs of those who are economically marginalized. Isobel?
Thank you very much. And thank you to Masego and to the Southern Africa Trust for extending this invitation. It's like old days to an extent to share a platform with Herbert and Deprose, even though it is very remotely, and of course you, Masego. You're right. I mean, there was great jubilation last week after the announcement by President Ramaphosa of the social relief, the stimulus package in total, far more than we had anticipated. Just briefly, for people who are not necessarily familiar with the South African social security system, we inherited from apartheid a system that focused on social security support for children, old age pensioners and people living with disabilities, and a few other small categories. But there's been a yawning absence, despite the constitutional right to social security, for working age people, 18 to 59-year-old. And in South Africa, we've got an exceedingly high level of formal unemployment, looking at about 40%, with a huge level of unemployment specifically for young labor market entrants, so 70% if they look at the expanded definition, for people between ages of 15 and 24. And so with the outbreak of COVID-19, we began to see a lot of fault lines emerging. I mean, I would say that firstly, there was a huge amount of pre-existing hunger. According to our last poverty trends report of Stats SA in 2017, 1 in 4 people were living below the food poverty line, which is essentially the starvation line. So 1 in 2 people living below the upper bound poverty line. So we had a huge number of people who I would call the invisible poor. We also have an increasing informal economy, traders, waste pickers, etc. And all their activities were shut down. People were also quite reliant on piecemeal jobs, for those who are not counted as formally employed. And so we saw an utter severance of ways of obtaining income. For workers as well, for employed workers, we saw a lot of delays in our unemployment insurance fund scheme, which was repackaged in order to be available for people, employers not applying, etc., etc. So we were in an income-strapped situation, and we were beginning to see emerging outbursts of riots and protests, specifically around food. The state's initial response was really to rely on food parcels. And so there was the establishment of a solidarity fund between business, government, and various other funds, as well as citizens who were donating. And that was basically food parcels, the gift of the giver, and other well-known humanitarian responses kicked in. Of course, that was nowhere near able to reach the households, extent of the households, both in terms of numbers and depth, and also geographic reach, spatial reach, people in rural areas and rural provinces not being able to obtain that. And so that a number of us did a lot of lobbying in the weeks preceding the announcement. We've seen the re-emergence of a strong civil society coalition and sort of an umbrella body, so a number of different interest coalitions coming together on this. And there were demands, for instance, for a top-up of the child support grant by 500 Rand and for 6 months. A number of us were concerned, however, that the incomes of informal workers were not being subsidized. And we were relying on a pre-existing grant capacity called Social Relief of Distress, which on the statute books is a 3 to 6 month emergency relief fund. It was mostly going out as food parcels, and a lot of our engagements with the president through NEDLAC and other fora, a lot of use of the media, was to say that needs to be income. And that goes to the title of this webinar, because from the global research, both from the Namibian, including the Namibian, and also research in South Africa on social grants, if money is in the hands of people, they can stimulate local economic development. We know that food parcels, the helicoptering in of food, immediately undermines the sort of local food production chains. I'm aware that I'm eating into other people's time. So your question, what was the reaction and how are we feeling now? Great jubilation. I think so in brief, what was announced was a top up to child support grants, as well as a top up to old age pensions, disability grants, and an expansion of social relief of distress to people who required it, who could prove their need, of 350 Rand. So initially the concern was about the value, that given the high food inflation that we've seen since the beginning of the year of about 7.6%, that the grants were tokenist. Our enthusiasm has since been dimmed by a legalistic interpretation of the president's words. He referred to child support grant beneficiaries. Now, in law, the beneficiary is not the child, but the caregiver. And so we see households where one caregiver applies for grants on behalf of multiple children. So for instance, if there are 3 children in a household, instead of getting 1,500 Rand additional per month, that household would only be receiving 500 Rand additional per month. So there was a lot of distress about that. Also, a lot of the economic modeling had been based on the assumption of it going per capita to children. So I was just saying offline that our concern has also been a notable absence of the Minister of Social Development to lead with communication on this, and also just to be a present figure in the face of the distress that COVID's causing. So yes, there is a huge lifeline going into communities. We believe that it's opening the door to debates about more universal basic support. But there is a bit of a bitter taste in the mouth compared to what we initially believed had been put into a stimulus and a sort of social justice response. I think you're still muted, Masego.
I forgot to unmute. Thanks for that, Isobel. It does seem like definitely the devil is in the detail here with regards to the South African response, that perhaps it's not as progressive as we initially thought it did. And I liked what you said about the role of cash transfers in unlocking economic activity at a local level and contributing to that wider impact beyond just the households that are recipients of the grants. And I know in your previous work, you've also looked at access to socioeconomic rights for migrant populations. And in the case of South Africa, we know that South Africa is a host for a large number of migrants. And in the next round, I'd really like for you to talk about what this has meant for the livelihoods of migrants at this time, when the borders have been locked down and a lot of people have lost their jobs or immediate income, particularly those who were in sectors that are not recognized, and possibly to touch on the informal sector as well. And just crossing over to Herbert, again, lots of excitement coming out of Namibia. You were involved for many, many years in a campaign on a universal basic income grant for Namibia. And with that many years of work, it seemed like the ideas that were tabled at the time might have gained traction in the policy space, because Namibia was the first one to announce a universal cash transfer, which turned out to be a once-off cash transfer. But can you also just share with us on what the response has been in Namibia, and also to what extent is it relevant and responsive to the needs of marginalized groups. Over to you, Herbert.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me now, Masego?
I can hear
unmuted.
you.
Good. Thanks very much. Yes, it's correct. We had for 15 years a campaign for a basic income grant here, completely independent of the coronavirus. And it was largely based on the structure of the labor market in the Namibian economy, where you have about 1/3 of the population employed in fairly permanent jobs. You have another third of the population completely unemployed, and that is by ILO definition, namely, if you worked just 1 hour in the previous week, you are regarded as employed, even if that work was just like catching some fish or collecting firewood for the household, etc. So even with that dubious definition, that is not really meeting realities in Southern Africa, a third was completely unemployed, and the rest, another third, so to say, was making ends meet somehow, informally, casual jobs here and there. So in the face of that, and given the enormous inequalities in terms of wealth, that Namibia, just like South Africa, is in fact not a poor country at all. The problem lies in the distribution of wealth. So the proposal came initially from a government tax commission to say, well, a step to redress these inequalities and to guarantee at least a basic survival for everyone would be the introduction of a BIG. We then tested it in practice in a, not test, but had a project, a pilot project in Ochivero, a village in eastern Namibia, to see how does it work in practice. And what Isobel mentioned was, in fact, the striking factor that if you pay out a basic income grant, it is not just a social protection measure. It's not just to keep people alive. It is in fact a stimulus for a local economy and for local economic activities that had not existed before. And that included in that village brick making, it included a bakery, it included sewing clothes, etc., etc. Hairdressers springing up and so on. So we've also seen there that the educational outcomes at the local schools improved dramatically, from over 40% of the children dropping out of school due to hunger. That was long before coronavirus. They reached a level with the introduction of a basic income grant, which was at the time only 100 Namibia dollar, 12 years ago, equivalent of 100 South African rand. And that had those kind of immediate impacts, vastly improved educational outcomes. And also in terms of health, which is now one of the aspects of corona, we could see that the local clinic was used far, far more than before. They had about 4 or 5 times the usage of the local clinic because people could pay the $5 required to be examined by a nurse. So that was almost a symbolic payment, but even that small amount was enough to keep people out. That shows you the level of desperation. So in the face of that, we were convinced a basic income grant is absolutely essential and necessary. Now, in the current situation, what has happened? Despite the chairperson of our coalition becoming the Minister of Poverty Eradication and announcing basically that BIG is a done deal and it would be implemented, it wasn't. So 5 years later, we sit with the same dilemma. And we, in fact, have not made any step towards it. Even the policy document of the ministry talks now about a BIG for unemployed people between 30 and 59. Now, that's not a basic income grant at all. That's an exclusive unemployment grant because it doesn't even cover everybody. Why are unemployed people, for example, between 18 and 30 excluded from it? So that was quite a disappointment last year, but now coming to the current situation. What has happened is with the lockdown and the collapse of whole industries and the suppliers, for example, tourism, which was a big industry in Namibia, 15% or so of GDP, and thousands of jobs around directly tourism, but also flights, drivers, suppliers of lodges, etc., etc. It was an industry that was one of the few that was growing fast in Namibia. It's completely gone, of course, with the lockdown. And that means we will have tens of thousands of unemployed people more. You will also find in a lot of the SME businesses that they basically are facing collapse. And even the informal traders, because they couldn't reopen until last week, there was a massive crisis and an immediate crisis. And in that context, it was interesting that the Ministry of Finance, it was not driven by the social ministry, not labor, not the former, not gender ministry, not the former poverty eradication ministry, drove it to say, well, if there's such a need, if so many people are losing their livelihood and have nothing to fall back on, the only way to address that is with a cash grant. And they called it emergency income grant, not basic income grant, but emergency income grant. And the finance minister, the new one, went public and said, we have calculated that as an adult person, to meet your absolute basics, you need 1,000 Namibia dollar equivalent of 1,000 rand per month. So they calculated 250 per week. And on that basis, for the initial 3 weeks lockdown, they paid out $750 to everyone. What was also interesting is that they defined who qualifies. They said it must be people who lost income and they must be below the taxable income rate. Now in Namibia, taxable income rate is if you earn 50,000 a year or more, 4,166 a month. And they said everyone below that can qualify. And that was interesting because you could not set up an elaborate bureaucracy to register people and to check everyone. So they worked very quickly. They had an SMS number, you dial there, or you send an SMS with your ID number. The ministry then checked, are you a recipient of another grant already? Then you won't get it. And they checked with the database of the Ministry of Finance, are you earning more than the 4,166 per month? If not, you got it. And that followed almost what we said. We proposed it universally to say everyone should get it. And from those above a certain income bracket, you recover it through the tax system. So you basically give it, but you take it back immediately, or you take more as a redistributive method. But the principle was that the ministry recognized for the first time those who earn less than this 4,166 are in need of support. And they cannot now fiddle around with a thing of identifying which household gets a food parcel, which one does not. It won't work, and it has created chaos, as we've seen subsequently with the food deliveries. It was an absolute disaster. But they then said, in terms of numbers, Namibia is of course much smaller, 760,000 people would qualify for the income grant, and they've reached about 300,000 so far. Some were rejected because they were already other recipients of other grants, and another 300,000 or so, or 350,000 are being tested now. They might still get it. What it has shown is what we've always argued, it's the quickest way, the easiest way, and it gives people the chance to decide what they need the money for. It's not this paternalistic dishing out of food parcels when your need is something else, but you get a bag of milli-meal because that's what the food parcel entails. And I think in that sense, it was interesting that it was a technocrat who doesn't come from a social ministry at all, who was the first one to say, in this crisis, if we want to reach people, cash grant is the only thing that can work fast and quick and efficiently.
Thank you. And the technocrat must have been reading the right materials. Maybe the early stages of the BIG, the idea was well ahead of its time. And as part of the advocacy agenda, we have to continuously ask ourselves, why now? What is the moment now that would make it possible for those who are making decisions pay attention to the ideas that are coming from civil society? But I think what you're sharing with us is really important lessons for how we reimagine the future. And if these ideas are to carry on post-COVID and become part of the architecture of rethinking social protection, there's some important lessons to be learned from both how Namibia is rolling out the economic relief packages now, and some of the debates that are coming out of South Africa, Mauritius, and the other neighboring countries. I think this is a perfect moment to turn over to Deprose. Deprose, I introduced you in absentia. So glad you could join us. So for you, I'd just like us to have a discussion that's more at a regional level and talk about the trends that we're seeing emerging in the various countries in the region around the COVID responses and the economic stimulus packages and the extent to which these are responsive to the needs of marginalized communities. Over to you, Deprose. Muchena? You are unmuted, but there's no audio coming from your end. Deprose? Okay, I think Deprose is struggling to connect. What we can do while he's getting back online is to go through some of the questions that have come through for both of you, Isobel and Herbert. There's a question here that says, how can social protection in response and beyond the crisis ensure that communities and groups can be included? Considering that those who are marginalized and vulnerable, their livelihoods face criminalization and non-recognition, and they are not included in state precautions and economic provisions. And then the second question speaks about care work, and I think Isobel began to touch on this, and it's that care work remains unrecognized and not included in how we think about work. What will it take to shift the economic mechanisms to acknowledge care work in statistics as well as in the responses, and to ensure that it removes the harmful, the impacts of harmful gender norms and child labor?
Can I come in here?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I hope Deprose is able to join us, but Herbert, thank you for that. And the questions I've been enjoying reading. I think the question about care work and also the one about gender mainstreaming by Lebogang are really useful. I think at this juncture, when we're looking at a new way of seeing the world, care work is definitely something that needs to be better recognized. I was saying to someone yesterday on discussion that, in fact, because of the nature of lockdown that South Africa is facing, services to an extent have become much more surface than production and manufacturing. I think I would throw back a question, because I know that within the South African policy field, there have been concerns about, there have been calls to have a caregiver grant. So for people who look after children who receive a child support grant, to extend to the caregiver a specific grant. And I think we need to be very aware of what that does, because one can also be pragmatic, which is necessary, and sometimes too theoretical. That was really my emphasis. To some extent, the concern is that generally a woman is paid for her gendered role. So instead of as an individual receiving some kind of a support, she's given support because she is of her role in social reproduction. And the question of whether or not that ties people into societally recognized and expected roles rather than being emancipatory. Having said that, we are seeing renewed interest in the community care workers, the healthcare workers. There's certainly demand for their recognition for provision of PPE. In NEDLAC last week, we heard a presentation about including them on the social insurance. So, for instance, initially with COVID-19 impact, but really that seeks to equalize their employment status to an extent, as opposed to being a public works thing as a marginal employment. And so I think that there really is time to push for the fact that as a society, there is unrecognized, unpaid care work. And we know that some economies add that to GDP. I just want to quickly, before I hand over to others or look at other questions, Masego, you asked specifically about non-nationals. And I know that this is taking it back, but it's interesting because I was consulted by someone from Lawyers for Human Rights last week in that regard. And in South Africa, our legislation makes provision for refugees as grant recipients. And so there was some debate because some elements of government were saying that this was citizens only. So refugees would be included. In addition to that, asylum seekers in January won the right to be employed. And so we are pushing for that as well. The question of migrant workers, cross-border migrant workers, is something which hasn't yet been taken into account, which is quite critical because many of the migrant workers, especially from the region, are employed in the informal economy and so are directly impacted, and with the closing of borders are not able to go to their countries of origin. So in summation, there is a vast number of people who are not legally included. There are grants for extending to asylum and refugees, asylum seekers. And I would like to hear some debate around the question of how one recognizes care work in a way that is transformative.
Yeah. Thanks, Isobel. Herbert, you're on mute.
Yeah. The question of how to reach the most needy, the most vulnerable, presupposes always there must be some kind of testing mechanism. And we looked at that in Namibia because when you look at conditions in which households operate, you find that their condition is anything but permanent. So you have a construction worker, for example, who is now head of household, has 6 or 7 dependents that rely on him, and is employed for 6 months on one of those projects. But when the project ends, they fall back into absolutely nothing. In rural areas, you have this year where we had good rains, a bumper harvest is predicted. So rural households might now have a better chance of making a living. Next season, that might change dramatically. Now, if you want to follow a whole population in the South African case, like 40, 50 million people, in Namibia, 2.5 million, all the time in terms of their needs, in terms of their socioeconomic status, and you want to adjust specific targeted grants all the time, you need such a battery of civil servants who need to be extremely ethical so that they're not corrupted and say, okay, you found a job, now actually I have to take you off the grant, but my brother, can we make a deal here? I leave you on and we have an understanding. That would happen because very often these bureaucrats would run alone into the villages, into the townships, door to door to get the data. And it's up to them which boxes they tick.
Yeah.
But besides the danger of corruption and like party members maybe being more favorably treated than opposition members, which will always come into play. We've seen that already with the food bank here.
Yeah.
You would require such a lot of money to keep that bureaucracy afloat of means testing the population almost all the time. And you would spend in the end more on those means testing than you would spend on the grants themselves.
Yeah.
And that's where we said, if you talk of efficiency, it is far, far better to give a universal grant, to then have, through the Ministry of Finance, an efficient tax system that captures incomes, and to say everyone gets it. That would ensure if you're rural, urban, part-time employed, casual, exploited at ShopRite for a lousy 2,000 Rand a month, etc., you would be covered by such a basic income grant. And it would cover you for eventualities like this virus now, but also for the more recurrent floods or droughts, etc., or collapses of certain industries, that when government runs out of money, infrastructure projects come to a halt and construction workers lose their job. So the question over how do we reach the most vulnerable, the best is to have a fairly wide-reaching universal grant that captures that, and where you don't punish people then for finding work, for earning additional income. Because that's the other disadvantage of the targeted programs. It's a kind of punish reward. As long as you are unemployed, we get you. Now you find a part-time job, now we take the grant from you. And that is the opposite effect of what you want to achieve. And I think these are some of the lessons that we learned very clearly in Namibia, in Ochiwero, that people use that money very wisely. And even if it's a very modest amount like it was here, it makes a difference in people's lives. And anyone who wants to see it is welcome to go to that village today. People will tell you.
Yeah, thanks, Herbert. I think what you did really well was to touch on the question of affordability, which is one that is raised each time a discussion is held about the universal basic income grant, but also on the efficiencies side of things, like how do you ensure that if it's efficient, and how do you administer it if it's distributed to everyone? And we'll come back to that question of affordability, because I'd love for Isobel to also talk about the work that they did around the feasibility of a universal basic income grant at a regional level funded out of the extractive sector. Deprose, I introduced you earlier in absentia. Welcome, and we're glad you could sort out the connectivity challenges. Just before you went off, I'd actually posed a question to you and say we shift from the Namibia and South Africa story to talk about the trends we're seeing in the region around the economic relief packages for COVID, but what that means for creating social safety nets for marginalized populations. Over to you.
Okay, no, thank you, Masego. I'm delighted to be back and happy to see Comrade Herbert and Comrade Isobel on the line. I think for much of what I would have said has been captured by my colleagues, but if you stretch the picture into the region and you remove the sort of very organized, disciplined, deliberate approach of response we see in Africa, and just take off the region outside of this sort of exceptional case, there are three issues that emerge. One is COVID-19 arrives into the region at a time when there are pre-existing political economic conditions that make the region unable to respond effectively, either through social policy or through economic policy writ large. First, because in the first instance, the nature of our economic policies in the region are not people-centered. So these are economies that are driven fundamentally by a model that responds to the formal sector of the economy. And the informal economy, the communal economy, is excluded. And we know that the region deals with this dualism and enclavity legacy. So COVID-19 arrives in a region that is like that: mass inequality, mass unemployment, mass poverty. And to try to respond through a public health approach, which requires accompaniment of enforced quarantining through security forces, ignores the fact that there are huge problems in our countries. So that's the first big problem. The second is the underlying problem of the soft underbelly of the region, that these inequalities are not just in incomes, they are also gendered, they are also generational, they are also based on able-bodied people, disabled persons, persons with albinism. So if you look at the cluster of the responses we have seen by just examining the cluster of women, you'll see that there's the double jeopardy On the one end, you have pre-existing inequalities that disproportionately affect women. From a rise in the burden of unpaid care work that we are observing across the region, to disruption in the supply of resources such as antenatal care and postnatal care. And what you then see is a threat towards a rise in maternal mortality over the next couple of months. If you look at the stimulus packages that are coming, they do not take into consideration the fact that there are people who have to go and fetch water from their homes. There are people who need to travel in the 8th month of their pregnancy to go into a maternity waiting home, which they can no longer do. It doesn't factor into the fact that there are women in rural areas who are victims of obstetric fistula, which affects a lot of women who are then discriminated against. So the responses we are seeing are largely about rescuing the economy defined as businesses. So if you look at the particular category of South Africa, you see a lot of money is going into business in the hope that then jobs can be secured and then people can get incomes. But if you go outside of South Africa, you go into Malawi, you go into Zimbabwe, you go into Mozambique, there are non-existent social protection packages because there's non-existent social policy in the first place. So that's what we need to fix if we're going to be talking about the future of social protection. We need to have aggressive social policies. And the third is the character of the state. I think our states in Southern Africa, for the good that they are trying to do during the period of COVID, have tended to look for the most part like captured states, but captured by a range of groups that take them away from deliberately addressing poverty and inequality towards what I call the instrumentalization of the state, towards something else. So to get social policy going, we need to free the states from capture so that they see that not only during COVID times, but at all times, the responsibility of the state is to meet the needs of poor people, is to create conditions for local economic development and job creation, and is to pursue the project of development and democracy as two things going in parallel motion, but converging around government. So our region is really a region that is ripe for a re-emphasis of the importance of a rights-respecting economy, an economy that is built around a set of rights that must be enjoyed by all. And I saw on the sidebar question somebody saying, no, but Botswana doesn't have a justiciable Bill of Rights. Gone are the days when governments can hide behind a lack of justiciable rights as a way of not meeting the social needs of people. International obligation, social obligation, and the responsibility to protect requires of civil society and governments to really demand of states to do more to meet the rights of people. I think that's what I would say is the regional agenda at the present moment.
Thanks for that, Deprose. And I like that in your interventions, you also began to respond to some of the questions. There was a question from Lebohang around how we ensure that there is a feminist and solidarity approach that is not premised on public-private partnerships or corporatized business models. And you began to unpack some of that. I think we in our discussions we've highlighted where we see the shortcomings and the inadequacies, right? But there's certainly some movements that we're seeing in some of the governments that are beginning to go in the direction that you were taking us, Deprose. If you look at the response coming out of Mauritius, wouldn't you say it's an inclusive response that begins to show a state that is throwing away the shackles of being captured by the various interests that we see? And there's a question that comes from Dempers, where he's asking about Namibia, but I want to throw it to all of you as a regional question, because I think it's a question that applies to the broader movement, which is really around the practical steps and actions that are needed now to realize the dream of inclusive social protection. He talks about realizing the dream of BIG, the basic income grants. But I just want to broaden that, like the opportunity for us to rethink the social policies and to also rethink the economic policies to ensure that they're inclusive. And then there is, I'm skimming through the questions. It's quite a lot of questions. And just looking at the time, some are similar questions, so I'm going to skip them. There's a question that has come up, which says, how do we safeguard the role of the state to its intended role as a developmental, social protection and public service as it's playing now, and not to undermine capital to reorganize in the aftermath of COVID?
I will jump in here as well. I think that it was really interesting hearing Deprose's regional analysis. I think a couple of things struck me which really refer to the answers as well, and to your question. The point about capital organizing speaks to the question of financing. A lot of the calls for greater social protection in the past have been met, as people have said, as you've said, by the response that we don't have any income. We don't have enough revenue. Now, and that really looks at the role of the state. In an article I wrote in the Daily Maverick last week, I was perhaps slightly tongue-in-cheek recognizing and welcoming the return of social democracy to South Africa, and the kind of vanquishing of neoliberalism. I still think that probably was a little idealistic, but we must encourage. But it does go to the heart of how are we going to see financing going forward. Many of our economies in South Africa, the one I know best, are anticipating a huge decline in revenue, and hence kind of the state coffers will be depleted to an extent. And so you raised the point about the extractive tax. That's certainly something that needs to be reconsidered. My pragmatic sense is that governments will be so keen to get foreign revenue coming in that they'll be loath to attach any further taxation onto extractives. I mean, that's really the sense. Our mining sectors have been the one sector that has been sort of prioritized in terms of easing of the lockdown. Coal mining went on throughout, and gold and uranium, platinum. I think what I wanted to raise, and it came out in a tweet this morning, was the identifying additional tax bases. So this also talks to the developmental state and how that's funded. I spent some time this afternoon looking back at the Tobin tax, which was an idea which was generated in 1971, which is the year of my birth. And in the last couple of decades has reemerged as a transaction tax, a financial transaction tax. I think that we need to be looking at new forms of revenue rather than just going back to the old ones. Another article came through looking at the wealth tax, and I was just looking at the World Inequality database that launched a 2017 report, a global report, and that just identified that 30% of South Africa's wealth, so that's not income, is owned by 0.01% of people in South Africa. So the question of unlocking that wealth is critical if we want to really stimulate an economic regrowth. I think the point about the role of the state, however, is crucial. It's definitely a site of struggle going forward. We've seen, for instance, an unexpected, I would say, starkly arrogance among some state officials because they believe that jobs are not on the line because they're heavily protected by the alliance, that's the main trade union federation. The lack of empathy that we've seen in frontline delivery services, people are inundated, but there is a sense of privilege. And I think the role of public servants needs to be encouraged to be far more empathetic and proactive in terms of ensuring people's well-being. But I do think that the the role of the state as quite a firm regulator of distribution in terms of social democracies, and the understanding from capital that it should not expect to have the levels of profits that it accrued in the past, or that those will be mediated by state take, really needs to be appreciated. The last thing that I wanted to say is, Deprose was talking about sort of popular voice in terms of shifting. One thing that struck me is, in South Africa in the past, we've really taken to the streets in order to call for change. So demonstrations, protests. Now that language is closed off now with lockdown. And so we've seen a great emergence of social media as being a modality. And it's interesting to see how that shift can gain a far greater significance. There's probably a class bias to that as well, a language bias. But I really think that in the days when we see soldiers out on the street to enforce lockdown, we need to be thinking a lot more creatively about how the pro-developmental progressive human voice is heard.
Yeah, thanks, Isobel. I really hate to have to interrupt you, but I'm looking at the time, and I would just like to get Herbert and Deprose to throw in their last words there as well. Thank you so much for that. Herbert, and then back to you, Deprose.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll keep it very short because I want to hear more from Deprose.
Good.
It's been a long time since I've seen him directly. The question of the role of the state and how can we practically move to a BIG, they're inherently linked. Because the new economy that we need to look at and the new social order post-COVID cannot be built on what we had before, cannot be built on what we had last year.
Yeah.
And that is an inherently political question where we come up against existing political elites as well as existing economic elites. The fishing sector, the mining industries in Namibia, the land barons, they wouldn't want to hear any of that. We must be very clear. And they've co-opted a significant part of Southern Africa's ruling elite to do their bidding for them. So the fact that we don't have, for example, even an inheritance tax in such an unequal society like Namibia or South Africa is an indication of that, because the new elite also wants to pass on their riches to the next generation without making a contribution to the fiscal. But we also need to reorganize our economies as a whole, because Southern Africa is largely, especially the SACU states, completely dependent on South African imports. So if South Africa closes the borders, and the president has once had to backpedal on its announcement, no medical supplies will be sent to Namibia anymore. It caused an uproar here, because all of a sudden you realize, but then we're dead in the water. If South Africa closes the border, Namibia will starve.
Yeah.
So we must go back and say, what are the essential that we need to produce locally? What are the things that we need to produce in regional value addition chains that are reliable and not dependent on a new president coming in and in a Trump-like fashion just tramples agreements to pieces. And we need to do the selective delinking from globalization that Samir Amin has talked of for generations or decades already. That we need to not question between, are we slaves of China or rather of Europe or the US? That's an irrelevant question. We don't want any of these imperial powers to dominate the region. So we need to put an end to that and say, how does Zimbabwe, Namibia, Botswana, and Malawi work together to process our fruit into juices that we then have and into jams, starting off with the resources we have, with the fish, etc. And then based on that, we can very easily determine what would be a sustainable basic income grant for all that in such an economy you can develop. In the short term, we must do exactly what Isobel said. We must tax heavier the rich. We must redistribute budgets. We must stop wasteful infrastructure expenditure like new airports, etc., that have no multiplier effect at all. But now I'm glad to hear more.
Thank you so much for that. But yeah, definitely the social protection cannot be looked in isolation from what happens on the side of taxation and what also happens in the broader economic and social policy space, as Deprose had said. Deprose, over to you before I wrap up. I always feel like we don't have enough time for these discussions. Deprose?
We definitely don't have enough time, but thank you very much. And the sort of vision that Herbert was now rolling, for it to be, I share that vision because it leads to a path towards an aggressive social policy first. In that social policy, a social protection program. So I think it's important, but for these things to happen in this crisis, we have that we need leadership.
Yeah.
And a crisis moment, Masego, can be the birthplace of inspirational leadership. As we are seeing, there are a number of leaders who have emerged, the governor of New York, President Ramaphosa here. There are leaders who are emerging during this moment, but a crisis moment is also a point of consolidation of authority figures posing as leaders, who then look at a crisis as a moment for political accumulation. We've seen in this region, presidents, political figures who are taking sanitizers and put their picture on it and distribute to the poor. They are the ones who need to be sanitized. So in the absence of inspirational leadership, social policy programs that we're talking about don't occur. And that leads me to my second point, which is the rethinking development itself. We should see development as an enterprise, largely in favor of the poor, because that's the struggle we have. And development should not be seen as just multiplying the impact and quantum growth of economic growth. About how we distribute the benefits of growth so that we deal decisively with the triple burden of unemployment, poverty, inequality. In the absence of that, you then have this lopsided exclusive development projects, which are now creating a fight between our societies among poor people and rich people. Poor people are afraid of hunger. Rich people are afraid of the virus. That's why you can't lock down poor people in Katutura and in Mashakeni and in the Jauch compound in Zambia. So we need a development program that really is about putting people first. The one Isobel talked about, we need new forms of revenue. I completely agree with that, because in a depressed macroeconomic environment that we have, there are limited resources for each state. There's limited fiscal space for each state to reimagine what it can do. If you look at what Germany has done, the largest contribution of fiscal response, 2.2 trillion euros. 60% of Germany's economy is responding to COVID. In Zimbabwe, 600 million Zimbabwe dollars. Calculate that into dollars and into US dollars, you see what it means. To get new forms of revenue, we need to tackle the long-standing problem of debt so that there can be an effective debt moratorium, debt relief, or debt cancellation, so that you release money into the budget to respond to this pandemic we have. South Sudan has 5 vice presidents. It has 4 ventilators. It is not going to respond on its small budget. Central African Republic, most of our countries. So we need to be joining campaigns for a new kind of international cooperation, a new kind of multilateralism, a new kind of leadership, and a kind of commitment to a human rights agenda for South Africa to get us to a new social protection program. Thank you.
Thank you, Deprose. I think that's an excellent point to end on, where you're talking about the need to sort of coordinate and build voice and call for change that we want to see within the international multilateral space, but also the change that we want to see at a national level and at a regional level. Isobel earlier talked about the re-emergence of popular voice and social democracy in South Africa, and I would add in the rest of the region as one of those energizers around what, how we rethink what Herbert was saying earlier when he talked about a post-COVID that cannot be built on what we had before. And as I said at the beginning of this conversation, this is a series of dialogues. We started last week. This is the second one. And every Wednesday at 4 p.m., we would be having these kinds of dialogues with people from civil society, from social movements, and providing a space as well to hear directly from the vulnerable communities themselves. And we are hoping that through these discussions, we can organically share knowledge, share some thinking around solutions now and also solutions going forward in the future that we want to see. And the common thread throughout the stories that you have told, the three of you, is just the power of ideas and driving ideas from the space of civil society. In some instances, it may seem like nobody is listening, but when crisis hits, they actually dust off that BIG policy brief that you would have sent them, and they implement it as it is. We should be asking ourselves as civil society, how do we organize to sustain some of the gains we have seen now, to also sustain the energy around rethinking the social and economic order that has gotten us here, and just reimagining the future. I hope you'll join us again next week. I'm not sure yet what the topic will be, but we will be posting it on social media and reaching out, as I said, to civil society, to social movements, to the vulnerable groups, and in some cases as well, reaching out to the government so that we can begin to talk about the responses within the formal space and look at multi-sectoral dialogues in the same event. So thank you so much to my panelists and to everybody who joined us. See you again next week.
Thank you. See you.
Bye-bye, comrades. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.